Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll sure shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another fantastic episode featuring a return visit from our Canadian friend, the Naked Pastor, David Hayward. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, welcoming you back to this episode. I am really excited to be bringing you this episode today with David Hayward. We are talking about religious trauma, primarily around the subject of the cults, which, as you know, if you've been listening to any of my episodes since January, I've been delving deeper and deeper into this subject, going down into the rabbit hole, because what I've discovered, especially in talking in the episode 2 weeks ago with Chris Shelton, who is a former Scientologist, basically grew up in the Church of Scientology and got out I think it was about 6 years ago. And something he said really hit me. He said that one thing he's discovering is that regardless of what cult or religious experience people have come out of, you strip away the ideology, and what we're discovering is that it's all about the mind control. It's all about the psychology of how we were manipulated, how we were controlled within the particular group or religion or cult of which we were a part. And as people are comparing stories, we are now realizing that the recovery path, it is obviously going to be different for every person, isn't it? But the basic threads are all there. The psychology of it is remarkably similar from group to group and cult to cult. And this is something that Chris said in our episode the other week. And therefore you can step back and you can apply these kinds of models of how cults operate and churches, or we could say, in the words of Stephen Hassan, the cult expert, groups with undue influence. And maybe that's a better way to say it. There's some argument among people as to what actually is a cult, if we should define or label groups as cults. Stephen Hassan just says, let's call them groups with undue influence. Now, I think I need to define what Stephen Hassan means when he says undue influence. It's the same term that he means when he talks about mind control. In his book, Combating Cult Mind Control, he says, quote, both, that is mind control or undue influence, both refer to the process of controlling people by mentally hijacking their rational thought processes, end quote. And in this, we could slide in there evangelical fundamentalist churches, which is something I talked about in the very first episode back in January. And I've been reading Stephen Hassan's book, and it's very interesting because he puts it on a continuum. He's got like a spectrum, and this is from his BITE model, which is an acronym that stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotional Control, how groups with undue influence control their followers. And on the one hand of the scale, there are constructive groups, there are healthy groups. He's not saying that mind control is all completely a bad thing. For example, you might seek hypnotherapy to, break your habit of cigarette smoking. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That is a form of mind control. And what he says is that organizations provide helpful or constructive influence. I'm sure there are more healthy churches, more healthy groups out there, but he says this is basically how it works. Organizations that provide helpful or constructive influence have these basic or essential traits. He says, quote, it routinely seeks the informed consent of its members. Checks and balances are built into its systems of governance so that no one person or subgroup can seize control. He goes on to say that the group is transparent about its mission, its finances, its governance, and its decision-making processes. And he concludes by saying, healthy groups encourage the health, growth, and sanity of its members, end quote. And you see that in the groups that are healthy, leaders are honest, transparent, trustworthy. There's accountability. This is something that Rick Ross mentioned as well a a few weeks back in our episode too, the more transparency and accountability of the leadership of a group, then the less likelihood of abuses occurring. But if you go to the opposite end of the continuum, the opposite end of the spectrum, now we're getting into groups that have undue influence over their followers or their members. And these are the traits of undue influences. Stephen Hassan says, quote, no informed consent. Information is manipulated and controlled. It has a top-down structure with a single leader at the top and a small inner circle immediately below. He goes on to say the group is authoritarian. Orders are issued from the top, sometimes without explanation or rationale, and those below must follow them without question. It has no guiding ethical principles. All goals justify the use of any means. And he concludes by saying groups with undue influence focus on controlling, preserving, and acquiring power and information, but shares little of these with rank and file members and none with outsiders. And basically the whole point of what I'm saying is this, is that what Stephen Hassan says is, quote, if mind control is used to change a person's belief system without informed consent and make him or her dependent on outside authority figures, the effects can be devastating. The more a group seeks to control any or all of these aspects of its members' lives, the closer to the extreme end of the influence continuum it falls, and the more likely it is to be a cult, end quote. So, could we put evangelical churches into that definition? Absolutely we can. And this is something that David Hayward and I are going to talk about in a minute. The idea that how churches use doctrine and other means to control their members, to influence them. In that case, then, we are firmly within Stephen Hassan's sort of definition of a group with undue influence, and therefore churches are causing in their followers a huge amount of religious trauma, especially when you plug in abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, economic exploitation, and all the other things that go along with many, many controlling authoritarian churches with charismatic leaders. So these are things that we need to work on, especially if you've come out of that sort of story. Where are you now? Where are you in the process? I think you're going to find this conversation with David Hayward very helpful. So let's go on into it. I want to bring you now my chat with David Hayward. We're saying you're not crazy. You're actually growing. That's what deconstruction actually is. I am so happy to be welcoming back once again from Canada, the Naked Pastor, David Hayward. Thank you, David, for being a return guest on Mindshift Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, I just want to say a huge thank you, David, because I've heard since we did our first podcast, what was it? It was, I don't know, almost a year ago? Can't be that long ago. It was months ago anyway. I've heard so much positive feedback from people that it was so practical, so helpful. So I want to say thank you on behalf of any listener. A huge thank you, David, for the information you shared, because it certainly helped me, and I know it helped a lot of other people. So thanks for that.
Well, I appreciate hearing that, because that's what I do. Like, that's my passion, is helping people transition through traumatic deconstruction and negative experience with church and so on. So when I hear back from people that I've helped them in some way, that's very, very meaningful for me. So thanks for passing that on. Appreciate it.
It's not a problem. It's super helpful. This is what I was hoping we could get into in this episode, is talking about religious trauma and seeing where that goes, because as you know, I've been doing a lot of learning more information about the world of the cults. And I just had a conversation. This was the last podcast episode with Chris Shelton, who is an ex-Scientologist. Now, something Chris said blew me away. I had never thought of it. He said people from all over the world are coming together, ex-cult members, ex-evangelicals, ex-fundamentalists, and they're comparing notes. And what they're finding is that as they talk to each other, they're saying, hey, I had that same experience in my cult. Hey, I had that same experience in my church. And the
Right.
trauma and all that is so similar because the psychological control, the manipulation, the indoctrination was so similar that we're saying,
Right.
wait a minute, why is there this overlap? And we've got a lot of reconstruction, rebuilding to do. So I know that you do a lot of work with your community. What have you heard back in terms of feedback from the Lasting Supper? Isn't that what it is, your community?
Yes. Well, this is the thing, like when people are deconstructing, like I've mentioned, I think, and I commented on one of your tweets recently, that there's two kinds of deconstruction. So one kind is where you logically deconstruct, you change your beliefs or you lose your beliefs. The second kind of deconstruction is you change your relationship to the church. The people I am not, I help people who leave the church but don't change theologically. I do help such people. But what I found most with people in that category is they're looking for the perfect church. They stick to their theological beliefs, and they end up starting a house church or something, trying to return to the pure church in its origins. That's one kind of deconstruction that I respect and acknowledge. But the people I'm very interested in are those who deconstruct theologically. Their beliefs change. And this is very traumatizing for most people. And if they continue down that road, it most often affects their relationship to the church as well. So they end up deconstructing both ways, which is a double whammy. And it's very, very traumatizing, both internally and externally. Internally because of all the theological, emotional, spiritual changes they're going through, but also externally because their social lives change dramatically.
This is something I reflected on. This is something I learned from you in our podcast before. As you say, there's two kinds of deconstruction. One is your relationship with the church. The other is your theological worldview. And I went back and analyzed my own path, and I realized that I started by deconstructing my relationship with the church. So I left the church because I was disillusioned with the way I'd been treated by other Christians and some other things. But then I still very much felt like I was retaining my Christian identity. I was very much a Christian. Mm-hmm. Then I started deconstructing the theological worldview, as you say, the other path, once I'd left the church. And now I see it, how it sort of unfolded. And I feel like I'm much more in that second path now. I've got a lot of questions. I've got a lot of things that I'm still working through. And so it was helpful for me, that model, to kind of put the pieces in place. And I think it was helpful for a lot of people to kind of step back as well and say, okay, so this is the path I'm on now. That's a very helpful way to kind of put it together, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It knocks you onto another path for sure. What I like to help people accept is that this new path is actually an extension of the one they were on. I really try to encourage people not to whole hog reject their history. Somehow it fits, and that their deconstruction is actually progress. It's actually growth, and it feels horrible. It feels like a demolishing. It feels like amputation, whatever. But
without anesthetic,
it is a form of growth.
But now you could take away the ideology, and you could put a cult member in exactly the same description you've just laid out, couldn't you? You could say, okay, let's take a person in the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology or the Children of God, whatever. They believed in the theology, as it were, the ideology of the cult or the group. And then there's the social, what keeps them in a lot of times is just like people staying in church. Why I stayed in church as long as I did was primarily because of the social community. I didn't want to leave those relationships, even though I was having some problems with the way the church was being run and the way I was treated by some Christians. So those same dynamics are at play, isn't it? Because when you leave any group, whether it's a cult or just a group, there's a social cost. What have you heard from your kind of group people about the social cost element when they left? They're losing all those relationships. That's a big deal, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's huge.
You're right. I totally agree with you. This is the connection to the power of cult. To a person, I'd say the most traumatizing experience that they have, aside from the theological shifts in their thinking, is the social crisis that they experience. Like I've said this before, and I still stand by it. I believe the church's greatest asset is its ability to provide community. It can be a sick community, or it can be a healthy community, but that's one of its greatest assets, is its ability to provide community. I mean, you can walk into any church, and if you put a little effort in, they offer you on a platter an immediate and sudden network of friends and the means by which to make them and keep them, with meetings and all kinds of things. So the church has got this community thing happening and I think probably in its earliest manifestations in history, that's probably what the church's greatest asset was as well, was its ability to gather people, like-minded people, and, provide support and fellowship, encouragement, whatever. So when our relationship with the church changes, and I have experienced the same thing, where I've been fired from a ministry, I had to leave a ministry under very strenuous circumstances, and I've left the ministry finally in 2010 just because I just had to move on. I felt like I was too constricted. And every time I felt the sudden loss of friends.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Loneliness is probably one of the greatest descriptions of people who are deconstructing and change their relationship with the church. And that can be anywhere from missing a bunch of friends all the way down to feeling disconnected from one's spouse and family because the beliefs are changing and we no longer feel we have the glue to hold us together. So yeah, they're like, I'm kind of rambling here. Do you mind?
No, go ahead. Keep rambling.
Okay. Like, I am fascinated by documentaries about cults because you watch them. There's some on Netflix. There's others you can watch. CNN put a couple out, and every one of them are so fascinating to me because they're interviewing people who've left the cult or escaped the cult, and almost all of them are crying. They miss the intensity of intimacy that they experienced there in the community. They were all of them acknowledge, or most of them acknowledge, the abuse that was going on and the stuff they had to put up with. But for them, it was a trade-off, or it was, it just came with the territory, or they put up with it because the reward was greater. So yeah, it's amazing to me, and I saw myself in many of those people. Just crying because I missed that intensity of fellowship and that sense of community. And they no longer experience that now, because they escaped from the cult. And so, it sent me down, with my online community, The Lasting Supper. I write, I communicate with them quite often. That's one of the things I have explored for myself. Was that normal, that community, that sense of community? Was that healthy? Was that real? And I think that's a valid question to ask.
Well, absolutely.
Don't you think?
Yes, because think about just the worship experience in a typical church setting. This is something that Keith Davis and I were talking about a few weeks ago, looking at our experiences in evangelicalism and saying, he said, was it real? Was it real? And I said, but Keith, I mean, what we experienced was absolutely real. It was. Those emotions were real. The community was real. The friendships were real. Now, some of it was very dysfunctional, but I said that's in evangelicalism. It's like this religious addiction. That's one of the things that keeps us coming back week in and week out, even though we might have problems with some of the theology or some of the practices of that particular church or whatever group you're a part of. What Robert Lifton calls mystical manipulation. It keeps us coming back. It seems spontaneous, but it's actually kind of managed. The way they can manipulate people by selecting certain songs and then moving into slower, more reflective songs. They're actually taking us on a journey emotionally, and that's very powerful. So it's real. It's absolutely real. It keeps you coming back.
Well, it felt real, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I don't want to say, like a lot of us are tempted to do, to look back and say, holy shit, I was duped. I was an idiot.
Exactly.
I reject all that. I'm moving on, forget it. And I prefer to try to figure it out, understand it. What were my motivations? How was I complicit? How was this all like sort of a mutual agreement? How was I abused? How did I let myself be abused? And I like to explore that because this is an important part of my story, and I want to figure out how this makes sense to me and how to integrate it and how to become an individuated whole person, because that includes my dark side and my unknown side and my stupid side and all that. So, but one of the questions I've asked myself is that intensity of intimacy and fellowship that we experienced, that community, was it healthy? Like that 24/7 spiritual voyeurism where you had to be completely honest and open and vulnerable at all times. And even with men's groups, let's say, for example, who you had to have a mentor that you were accountable to, and you had to tell him every time you masturbated or any time you were tempted to look at porn or, every little secret of your life, it was required for you to bring it into the light where it can be exposed and dealt with and confessed and forgiven and all that. I'm wondering, is that normal? Is that healthy? I'm really seriously asking that question because I suspect it's not. Like, I think intimacy is fine. I think fellowship is fine and community is fine and necessary. But how exposed do we need to be in order to experience true community? How spiritually raped should we allow ourselves to be, stripped naked and exposing ourselves in every secret? Like that's what the kind of community was. Everybody knew everything about everyone else. And it was, we were worshiping together, praying together, studying together, going through our struggles together. It was like, I don't know. And I see the same kind of thing in the cults where it's community and it's so intense and it's not, I don't think it's healthy to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I would, my response to that would be, according to Robert Lifton, that's when I read his book about psychology of totalism, he says that cult groups establish what's called a cult of confession. And it's all about, as you just described, everyone's opening up about every little sin, every little area of their life. And what he says is what that allows cults to control people by tapping into their guilt and shame mechanisms. So the more I know about you, the more leverage I've got over you. I know what your secret sins are. I know you're addicted to pornography. I know you're into this or that or the other thing. And I may not use it now. I may not use it tomorrow, but I've got it in my bank, as it were. I can pull that out and play that card, and I can use that against you. Right. And then there's another aspect. I was reading in a book by Janja Lalich about cults, and she said that the cult of confession, what it also does is it establishes a feeling of reciprocity. So I share something about me that's intimate, you share something about you that's intimate, and we go down this road together. And it's not necessarily very healthy, but it kind of breaks down the barriers of what we normally would keep reserved. And that's another means of control and manipulation that cults as well as churches can use. So here we go again. There's another parallel overlap between evangelicalism and the world of the cults.
Right. Well, why, okay. So, that's from the cult's angle. It's a means of control. But what about from my angle? Like, why did I do it? Why did it too? Why did I confess everything? And why did I tell people some things I shouldn't have told them? It's because there's something really rich and it feels awesome to be fully known and fully loved at the same time. And that's how it felt. I felt fully known, no secrets, and yet people still loved me and wanted to be with me and cared for me and supported me. So I think that's a good thing. Now, the cult side of it, or the church's side of it, is that it's kind of like a gateway drug or something. Like, it's like once you've tasted it, they know they've got you.
Yeah, you're hooked.
And that's what you're talking about.
I think so.
But from my angle, I loved it. I loved being known and fully loved.
Oh, so did
I loved that.
Except I
But it's a weapon.
I didn't
It's a
love
weapon.
failing, though. That was the thing, because in all those accountability groups that I was a part of, both as just a general Christian, and then later I was a part of pastoral accountability groups, which I'm sure you were part of those as well, meeting with other pastors and confessing our sins and our failures. I never, ever measured up. We were supposed to get 10 out of 10 every week, do 10 things every week, and the best I think I ever did was about 7 out of 10. I was supposed to pray with my wife, read my Bible, witness to my neighbor. I never ever hit 10 out of 10. So I was always striving and feeling bad about myself that I never got to the full 10 out of 10. So that can be an unhealthy side of it too, isn't it? Even though there's a therapeutic angle.
Absolutely.
Because something that Chris Shelton mentioned as an ex-Scientologist, he said, what's the lure of a cult like Scientology? Well, you come in and you might be a vulnerable person. Well, they're offering you therapy and you're confessing essentially what you just described. It feels good to open up and confess to someone else about what your struggles and your problems are. And it actually is helping people. It really is helping. It's just that the more you go down that road, the more open and vulnerable you get, you're opening yourself up to a lot of unhealthy things. And then that's when the cult-like levels of things can come into play.
Yeah, well, when I have been involved in intense community like that, and I always liked it, and like you, it was real at the time, and it felt wonderful. But the interesting thing is, when I started to challenge authority or question something, that's when everything changed. Like when I started to question things, then my vulnerability became their weapon. That's when things changed. As long as you submit and don't raise any questions or challenge the status quo or authority, then you're fine. But as soon as you start rocking that boat and threatening that community in any way or its leaders, then everything that you've confessed becomes a weapon against you. That's when things change.
Exactly. And they can use it back against you later. Because I had this happen to me when I was a pastor. They were always telling me, Clint, you need to be more transparent and open and vulnerable in your sermons. And when you got to model that, because if you can't expect people to be transparent and open if you, the pastor, aren't doing it yourself. So I remember one time I preached a sermon and it was about forgiveness. And I talked about this one instance where I'd lost my temper with a guy in the church and I was super stressed out. I lost my temper. I kind of went off on him and he deserved it, actually. Let me just say that he was out of line, but I was a bit too far. I didn't F and blank at him. But anyway, I got upset and he stormed out, said he was quitting the church. I ended up going back over to his house and asking his forgiveness we reconciled. And that was the story that I shared in a sermon. Well, later, though, one of the elders accused me of having a super temper problem and that I shouldn't be trusted because look what I did to this poor guy. Now I'm suspect because I've got an anger problem. So it was used against me. But I'm saying you guys wanted me to talk about my real life struggles, and I did, and you used it against me. And now I'm suspect. Now I've got an anger problem. So that's not healthy at all.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I am as well. I'm fascinated by the power of groups, and it doesn't just have to be religious. Like you remember the movie The Firm?
Oh yes, Tom Cruise, a good Scientologist, by the way.
Yeah. That's aside from
the movie.
But yeah, exactly. But in there, he gets hired by the firm, and he's very fortunate. Good job, and he and his wife go to the firm's first party or something, and everybody's dressed up in black tie and gowns, and they're drinking their champagne and everything, and his wife is talking with somebody and asked if they had kids, and she said no, not yet, and they're thinking about it and everything, and then they say, well, the firm encourages children. And I remember thinking the church is like that. Like that was the firm. It's a lawyer firm, right?
It sounds
and
familiar.
The firm encourages children. In other words, we want power over your reproductive rights, and we expect you to have kids real soon. And sort of that power of control of the group and the pressure to conform to their expectations. And because this is what it means to belong. And a human being hungers for belonging. And, we'll do will go through all kinds of measures in order to belong. You know, I know people, like I left the church in 2010. I visit churches now and then. There's one church in particular I like to visit, but it's like a couple hours away, so we don't get there very often. But I like that feeling of belonging and being loved and accepted for who I am. But there's a lot of people that will, including me in the past, there's people I know who will sacrifice some things in order to belong. It's kind of like the book Watership Down, where those rabbits escape and they come across another baron of rabbits, and there's something dark and sinister about this group of rabbits, and they come to find out that they've made a deal with the farmer, that the farmer feeds them, but once a week he calls one of the rabbits to eat. And that's the deal. That's the cost of belonging to that very safe and secure rabbit baron. And that's what community is like for a lot of people. There's something dark and sinister going on, but this is the cost of belonging. And a lot of our evangelical friends and churches and so on, this is what people are willing to pay in order to feel like they belong somewhere.
They'll overlook almost anything. Well, what is the dark and sinister side? Because, of course, if you talk to your garden variety evangelical, there's no dark side. We're preaching the light here, brother. We're trying to get the whole world saved. We're on a mission from God, like the Blues Brothers. We're doing all the right things for all the right reasons. Okay, they have a couple of issues. Yeah, they've had some sexual abuse scandals here and there. And you got Cardinal Pell down in Australia, that's the Catholic Church, though. We're evangelicals. What's the dark side, though, David? What is that you're referring to?
Okay. Well, it's the same with the rabbits. It doesn't mean anything to you unless it's one of your friends or you. Once your friend is called or you're called, then you get it.
It's not my problem.
There's too many people out there that it hasn't touched them yet, like it's touched me or like it's touched you. Like I was a little bit, blind and deaf to what was going on all around me until I wasn't. And until it touched me or somebody close to me. And when I started speaking out about this is a bad deal, this is what's dark and sinister going on, then that's when hell in all its fury came after me, right? And I realized that I no longer belonged. So yeah, I know a lot of people. I hear it every day. Every day I hear people say, "Why are you talking about this? It's very, very rare." I'm like,
no,
it's not very, very rare. I know so many people, and it's happening every day and in churches all the time. And, just look at the news with the Southern Baptist Convention or the United Methodist Church or with the Catholic Church or, there's just story after story after story every day in the news. Like, just do #MeToo and catch up,
Yeah, there's casualties, isn't it?
It's rampant. These people don't know. They don't realize it until it touches them personally.
Exactly. That's a really good point, isn't it? It's not my problem until it touches me personally or someone I know, and then you got to maybe investigate. Now, talking about religious trauma, that's the dark side that I've been exploring for the last 6 or 8 months. I put a post up around about the middle of December last year, and I asked people in the ex-evangelical Facebook page, I said, what sorts of religious traumas did you experience in evangelicalism? And it was a very short question, and I listed about 7 or 8. I said things like paranoia, anxiety, PTSD, emotional repression, issues around sexuality or the purity culture, and I kind of listed a few things, and I said, does that sound like what I'm talking about? Let's add a few more. I've got 3 pages. I just started cutting and pasting and putting them into this document. I think I've got over 50 some responses, and they're all different. They're related to some extent, but fear of the loss of salvation, suppression of my personality, stressing about not measuring up in that accountability group, loss of empathy. I could read on and on and on. That's the dark side, isn't it? This is personal from people who have experienced it themselves. And it's heartbreaking.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking to read it. I read this list and I'm like, my God, these people out there, they've had to go seek therapy and counseling, and they've got eating disorders and all kinds of hang-ups from their time in evangelicalism. And that is just saying that sentence is crazy. that shouldn't be the case. For everything that the church supposedly stands for, I shouldn't be able to say that. But as you say, that's got to be part of that dark side.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's, in my opinion, one of the sad things about religious trauma. It's a fairly new, it's a new field in psychiatry or in psychotherapy. Like, it's actually just now becoming recognized as a legitimate study, religious trauma, because it's becoming more and more known. More and more people are leaving the church for these very reasons. You know, it's because controlling people is the way most systems survive. And some systems are more cruel than others, but, you know, organizations, systems, institutions, this is how they survive, is by controlling people. And the evangelical church is guilty of trying to control people, and some churches are more guilty than others in their methods.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think it's like a spectrum, isn't it? Some are less controlling and perhaps less harmful. Some are way off the end of the chart. Well, what's the cause of this religious trauma? Because I asked on Twitter about a week or so ago, I said, if you're an ex-evangelical, what was more harmful to you in terms of religious trauma? Was it, one, the doctrines that you heard while you were in the church, or two, the actual psychological manipulation and control, as you just said? What was more harmful? And I got a lot of really interesting responses. Some were saying, no, definitely number one, no, definitely number two. But then a lot of people said, you can't separate those two. You could take a doctrine like hell, for example, and use it then to bludgeon people psychologically and control them and manipulate them with fear of the loss of their salvation, with fear of going to hell. So there's an overlap between the dogma and then the psychological aspects, which then causes religious trauma. Is that what you're hearing from your people as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the whole package. It's you know, I remember that night when I decided to start questioning the existence of hell, lying in my bed, breaking out in a cold sweat, absolutely existential terror overcame me because I was afraid of going to hell because I no longer believed in it. Now, the disconnect there, that I no longer believed in it, but I was still afraid of going there, that was real. That's real terror.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I can't just, I'm a smart person. And yet I was absolutely terrified. And that's used on people all the time. That's used on people every day. I was being interviewed for another podcast this morning, and the woman was talking to me how her family is still very sad for her that she's going to hell, because of, you know, her change in beliefs and her deconstruction, et cetera. And it's traumatizing. I mean, you know, it is a weapon. Absolutely. And, it's a form of controlling people. It's a fear tactic to get people to fall back in line and to reconform again. And it's happening more and more and more. As I really do think, as more people question their beliefs and leave the church, the level of abuse is going to rise, because this is how churches control people, is by manipulation and abuse and so on. So, you know, it's kind of like with the rise of liberalism comes the rise of fundamentalism. The more progressive we become, the more crazy fundamentalism is going to become. And I think it's the same with the church. The more people want to be free, the more controlling the church is going to try to be.
I've been reading the book Holy Terror by Conway and Siegelman. This was something that Rick Ross, who was on the podcast about a month ago, he's a cult expert. He said, if you want to learn about Christian fundamentalism, read this book, Holy Terror. So I got it off Amazon, and it's been absolutely eye-opening. I don't know if you've read it, but it's kind of scary how prescient it is. It was written in 1983, right after the Reagan era, and they're talking about how the religious fundamentalists like Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, and people like him were able to mobilize the evangelical fundamentalist vote to get people like Reagan elected and to enact the policies and things that they wanted politically. And they were able to motivate people, as you say, through fear of hell. So the fundamentalists have been doing it certainly since the late 70s, early 80s. So this is part of the playbook for sure.
Well, yeah, and I think that's something that the alt-right and everything has figured out. It's so much easier to mobilize people when you appeal to their fear than it is when you appeal to their intellect. It's so much easier to mobilize people with fear than with intelligence. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, we're seeing that in politics and we're seeing that in the church.
When you plug in then the emotion behind all that fear, that's hugely powerful. I read a quote the other day that said, reason, it rarely trumps emotion, because you can't just appeal to logic to people and convince them that they're wrong, or that's where you have a problem. Is we're not talking about sitting down and having a logical discussion with somebody. It's an emotionally laden, certainly in America, the society is becoming so polarized politically, religiously, that where's the whole thing going to end up? I have no idea, but I can't see things going back to the way they were if they were any good before. I don't know. You're saying that you think religious abuse is going to be on the rise. You're painting a pretty dark picture there, David. You're not too happy about that.
I don't think I'm a pessimist. I think I'm a realist. I just see
You're not
how,
an optimist.
you know, I think there's two things going on. I think there's churches are panicking because they're losing people, and they will resort to whatever method works. And I think abuse will become less overt and more sinister. So we might not see as much, let's say, I don't know, physical, sexual, crazy shit. But I think manipulating people with words is going to become a real skill set among church leaders. And the second thing we're seeing is the rise of accountability. Like we're seeing more and more reports. You just can't get away with stuff anymore like you used to. Everything's online. Everything gets reported, hopefully. And I think seeing that on the rise too, it's going to send things more underground, and things are going to get weirder, and control is going to be less obvious. But I think control and manipulation, coercion is still going to be employed to control people, but it's going to be done in a more clever fashion. That's your take. Yeah, it's kind of like what we're seeing in the news now, when somebody can say something and most reasonable people can say, whoa, that's racist. And they're like, that's not racist. What do you mean? I just said this. And they're like, well, yeah, but we know what you mean by that. And they're like, no. You're taking it the wrong way. I think that's what it's going to be like. There's no sense of nuance in the whole thing. Well, now you got to reconstruct all that, because whether you're coming out of a cult or coming out of that sort of evangelical system that we're talking about, you've got to go through so much. What are you finding in the people that you help? Because one of the things that Chris Shelton and I talked about in the last podcast was the difference between first generation cultists or church members and then second or third, those who were born into the system. There's a big difference there in terms of the path of reconstruction. What are you finding is there a difference in your perception of first or second generation ex-evangelicals or ex-fundamentalists? I find it really interesting because I see everything right across the spectrum. People are truly individuals. So I'm seeing, even in one family, where maybe a parent deconstructs, their marriage blows up, and the kids, let's say there's 3 kids, one becomes undecided, one becomes an atheist, and then the other becomes even more conservative, a believer. So I'm seeing stuff like that happen where parents deconstruct, but the kids, you never know. I have 3 adult kids, and they are all spiritual in their own way. They don't go to church anywhere. I don't know if they would identify as Christian, but they're definitely spiritual individuals. And spiritually independent. I'm proud of each one of them. But I know other families where each kid goes their own way. They could become more conservative. They could become more conservative and get angry with their parents for deconstructing. And, so it's a real mixed bag. Don't you see the same thing? Well, yeah, like you say, as the generations go along now, I'm hearing a lot of people on Twitter and ex-evangelical as well on Facebook that are saying, I'm not raising my kids the same way that I was raised. I'm allowing them the autonomy and the freedom to choose their own path. And so that's a big break, isn't it, for sure,
when you're looking at someone who's, especially you read through that list of religious trauma, some of them are just, they are heartbreaking. I mean, one person's talking about scars, physical scars from being beaten and being told that from their parents, God wants me to do this. I need to do this. They're saying, why would I want to raise my kids in sort of there's religious trauma in sort of a system like that, being told that being beaten and abused is God's will. I mean, that's just crazy. But that's the legacy of fundamentalism, evangelicalism. I can't even imagine. I mean, I was raised in a home where they spanked us and we were told that God, was condoning the whole thing. So I've got to sort through all that shit and separate out the abuse from the religious piece of it. The more I learn, the more I realize I've got more work to do. So I don't know where you're at on the whole thing, but it's a never-ending reconstruction. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, no, I think our personal growth is like an onion. There's just so many layers. And even when you think, okay, I'm healed now, and you kind of go into pause mode, and then something happens and you realize you've got more layers to go through. I think that's just natural for personal growth. But here's the other thing too. It's kind of like, excuse my language, but it's kind of like a mind fuck, because I was just talking with somebody yesterday who was really, really poorly treated by a church and fired and mistreated and pay withheld and no severance and totally ostracized and became a pariah. Like, just a nightmare of a story. And totally illegal. Like, as a company, you can't just fire people and not pay them. It's like, you can't just do that. And you can't withhold their severance and things like that. That's just illegal. But that's the thing. The people who did this, they're like, what's wrong? Like, we no longer work together. Like, this is, and this is the thing with the church. They think like they are beside or above the law. Like, the rules of the earth somehow don't apply. And that they're running their own program and they're under God. God is the king, and the whole spiritual rules thing, it's totally doesn't have anything to do with the court of the world or the state or whatever. So this is the thing with a lot of abusers and a lot of the people who have experienced abuse at the hands of these people. These people really, I think most of the time, are sincere. They think they're doing the right thing. Like you said, with parents who beat their kids and leave scars, like, they really think they're doing the right thing.
That's what the Bible says.
They're shocked when they're accused of abuse. Like, I've accused people of abuse, and they're shocked. People who I know abuse me, and they're shocked. They thought they were doing God's will. And that's a mind fuck, because you were abused by these people, and they don't think they abused you. So you feel like a victim, but they don't feel like they victimize you. So that's another layer of healing that many of your friends and my friends, the people I work with, have to deal with, is that sometimes it never feels like there's accountability or restitution or forgiveness, because they're like, I didn't do anything wrong. You know what I mean?
And then you tack on as you say, the biblical aspect of it. I mean, my parents, they were trying to raise their children in light of the Bill Gothard, the Institute of Basic Youth Conflicts, which I see now, I call it an absolute cult. He was a cult leader, a charismatic figure, seminars all over America, tens of thousands of people, but there was all this abuse, sexual abuse that's now coming out, the classic symptoms of a cult. But he was a fundamentalist. He taught, spare the rod, spoil the child. That's what the Bible says. And you, as godly parents, this is what you need to do. You are actually breaking the child's will. That's what Bill Gothard said. That's the purpose of spanking, corporal punishment, so that you are breaking their will so that they will not have the inclination to sin. So that's why it's so important. And they wouldn't say it was abuse. But as you say, looking at it objectively, you've got physical abuse plus this biblical sort of fundamentalist worldview shoved in there as well, justifying the whole thing. So yeah, there's a lot to unpick in that whole context.
Yeah, have you watched Holy Hell, the CNN documentary of that cult leader guy in Hawaii?
I haven't seen that.
Did you see that?
Sounds. I need to though.
It's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating because again, the same thing, this powerfully intense community and everything. And years later, he's still going strong and doesn't think he's done anything wrong. Like, it's just like crazy. So the people who come out of that kind of a cult, they missed the community, but they were definitely abused. They were raped. They were robbed. They were manipulated. They did stupid stuff. And yet there's nobody to blame, because he doesn't accept responsibility for doing anything wrong. So it's a real crazy deal for people who, I've experienced it myself. Like when I left the church or when I was fired from the ministry, no accountability, no sense of closure. My closure was my responsibility and mine alone. Nobody came to apologize. So I totally had to heal myself, and there was no sense of justice ever being done. It's totally me, my project, my personal healing. I have to do this, and I have to get on with my life and not expect any compensation in any form, spiritual or material. So that's one of the real difficult things about recovering from, evangelicalism or whatever it is.
That's a really good point, because the similar thing happened in my case. Although I wasn't fired, our church, we actually made the decision to close it down because it was heading, we could see that it was heading for a very ugly church split. So we made the proactive decision, let's close the church. This is going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Now, that was back in 2015. There are people still, 2005, before we moved to the UK. There's people in Portland, Oregon, who are still mad at me. All those years later, they're still angry and blame me for closing their beloved church down. As you said, I never had any closure. They blame me. They were angry. We closed it and walked away, and that was the end of it. So that was the way it was left. I was left, like you, to pick up the pieces. So, the legacy, again, of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, whatever you want to call it, it's just, it's so damaging on so many levels. And you've got to heal yourself somehow from that trauma.
Yeah, you've got to.
Otherwise, you're just going to become bitter and angry.
Yeah, you got to find a good counselor. And my advice is test drive them, get second opinions, move around, try different counselors until you find one gets it. Because there's I've been to a lot of counseling and therapy myself, and there's some counselors and therapists that just poo-poo religion of all kinds and that you were an idiot to believe in anything in the first place. And you don't want to go there. You want to go to somebody who understands religion, gets what it means to have a spiritual life and isn't condescending about it, and sees that your religious endeavors and history is valid. And so that's my advice to you. Find somebody who gets it. And I hope you're living in an area that has some counselors that would be able to do that for you.
Well, and I've also heard that it's not necessarily a blanket statement, but be aware or be wary of Christian counselors for the reason that some they may be well-meaning, but their worldview is to try to talk you back into the church. That's one of the big answers they're going to say is, well, okay, you need to be in church, period. Maybe not your old church, but find a church. That's what's going to be really helpful. We're going to open the Bible. And you're right back in all that stuff that you're trying to escape. So I'm not saying don't see a Christian counselor at all, but I don't know what your experience has been, but have you found any issues around specifically Christian counselors?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, I know one or two Christian counselors. They're counselors who happen to be Christian, actually. They're not Christian counselors. So they're counselors who happen to be Christian. They have valid licenses from the province or whatever, from the government. And they're recognized professionally, and they happen to be Christian. But they do not impose or suggest or anything to do with their beliefs on their clients. I do know others that are very stressed about people who are changing their beliefs or losing their religion or their faith or whatever. In fact, I've been to one where I remember this was years ago now, where I'm saying, I don't know if I believe in God anymore. And she's like, oh, you still believe in God. Come on.
Of course you do.
That kind of thing.
Talk some
so
sense
it's like,
into
okay, here we go.
I'm out of here.
I'll ride along with you for a little while, but it was very dismissive. So you need Yeah, on the one hand, you need somebody who doesn't dismiss religion. On the other hand, you need somebody who won't dismiss losing your religion either.
Well, and how important, too, is just the online support community, because you've got the Lasting Supper. How could people get a hold of you if they said, okay, what you're talking about, David, that makes a lot of sense. I want to be a part of that community. Maybe I can't afford counseling or there's nobody in my area, as you say. How can people get a hold of you and become a part of your kind of online support community?
Okay, well, it's thelastingSupper.com. It's $15 a month. I'll say right up. We charge for people to be members because of several reasons. One thing is I do it a lot. I spend a lot of time on it, moderating it and facilitating it. And another thing is we have a real website that costs money to run and maintain and develop. And thirdly, it keeps out trolls. It's a gateway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Trolls and bullies and so on can't get through. The people who are in there on the inside and do pay are very grateful. They love it. It's $15 a month. It's worth it. It's a safe place. And the cool thing, the neat thing, the interesting thing, the different thing about TLS, the Lasting Supper, is it's a variety of people. We encourage spiritual independence. I don't impose my belief system on anyone, and neither does anyone else in there. So we have anything from church-going people who are still struggling with their beliefs to people who are full-on atheists. And we all get along because our common value is we respect one another in our spiritual journeys wherever we are. So that's the cool thing, and it's a safe place for you to rant and process. Nobody's going to try to correct you or teach you or instruct you. We just listen and support you.
That's hugely important.
It's not a discussion board. It's not a ideas place of dialogue about theology or anything like that. It's just a place for you to be you, to vent, to support one another, to be heard, and to process because, well, our tagline is help yourself. I truly believe that people are given space and time that we can heal ourselves. And I had to do it. You're having to do it. Many people have to do it. So if you're given time and space, you can heal yourself. So that's what we do at the Lasting Supper.
And it's important to have a safe space, isn't it? That's why it's so critical that trolls and bullies are not allowed in that space, is it? Because, we have it on Twitter and everywhere, on Facebook. There's something about evangelicals, I don't know what it is, but there's a certain core of them that really come after ex-evangelicals like me and you. I don't know if I'm sure you've been trolled on Twitter, but it's not fun to be blasted by somebody who's just out to score points or slam dunk and quote Bible verses at you and prove, quote unquote, that you're wrong and that you were never a Christian in the first place and on and on. I've had that all said to me. I'm sure you've had it said. You were never a Christian, David. That's your whole problem. You were never saved. See, there you go. It's just that easy.
Well, it's because of that verse that once you've tasted the Lord, that you can never go back. And so a lot of people, I know that because I used to be a Calvinist, and once saved, always saved. And so that if you're not saved now, you could never have been saved. That's just their theological. Yeah,
you were never elected.
One of their cornerstones.
Yeah. So now they would say, well, David, you and I were never one of the elect. Actually, I don't know what we were doing for the last 20 plus years of our lives, going to Bible college, seminary, pastoring, teaching, doing all those things. Were we just self-deluded hypocrites? I don't know. Apparently we were in that system. What a crazy system. Well, the other thing I was going to say is if people want to get a hold of you, all they got to do is remember the words, the naked pastor. That's your kind of tagline, isn't it? They can find you on Twitter, Instagram, and everywhere else.
I want to issue a warning, though. It's one word, naked pastor. Don't do naked and then pastor with a space in between because you'll see some very horrific things. Yeah. Nothing to do with me.
Don't do a Google search.
Naked pastor, that's my brand name. Basically, it just means me being vulnerable and open and honest and raw, being real. And that's what naked pastor means. Well, it's nothing to do with nudity.
Yeah, and ironically, too, I was just saying this to someone the other day, that even though I'm not a pastor, quote unquote, anymore, as in a formal minister in a church, everything I'm doing, and I'm sure the same applies to you, we're still functioning, I feel like, as that pastoral role. everything I do in helping people, even the job that I do. I mean, I teach carpentry at a college over here in the UK, but a lot of the job is, it's the skills of learning how to be a carpenter, but a lot of it is mentoring and, building relationships with them, helping them when they have bad days and working through the problems that they have. That's pastoral work, isn't it? So we're very much still doing that sort of ministry, in quotes, like we were before. We don't have to prop up the system anymore, which is hugely freeing, I think.
Well, I think this is the way I argue it is, let's take James Fowler's. I think I mentioned this before in the last podcast I was on. James Fowler's Stages of Faith. He discerns 6 stages in our faith journey or our spiritual journey. And I think the church is awesome at supporting us up to stage 3. But the beginning of stage 4, where we start to question our beliefs, that's where the church drops the ball, because it doesn't know how to handle questions. It's very chaotic, very traumatic, very upsetting, and unsettling to the church when people start to ask questions. But this is a part of our growth, our questions. So what happens is, if people want to pursue their questions, they feel they don't have any option but to leave the church. That's where I come in. This is where I come in and help people keep going on their spiritual journey. And I love it. I'm very passionate about it, and I love helping people transition. I think it's a healthy move. It's like one of my cartoons I did recently where a woman's leaving the church, and she's got a thought bubble above her head where she says, growing. And the people inside the church have a thought bubble above their head, backsliding. Because that's the way the church sees people leaving the church.
Yeah,
as backsliding, and she sees it as her personal growth. And I really do believe that's the case. People who are deconstructing are actually growing. It's like a snake shedding skin. It's the way we grow. I hate to compare us to snakes, but it's a good analogy.
Yeah, I've been called a snake in the grass when I was a pastor, so maybe that'll help. I don't know. But as you say, it's hugely empowering to find other people that have had those shared experiences. Okay, maybe your experience isn't exactly the same as mine, but broadly speaking, we're talking the same language. We're saying the same things. We've had very similar experiences. And I think for people listening, that's validating. When you hear someone else describing kind of your experience, you go, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. There's other people in this thing. I need to keep going. So I'm really glad that you are doing what you're doing, because I've, like I said before, it's hugely been helpful to me. So, just speaking for myself, if no one else gets anything out of our conversation, I sure have. So I just want to say once again, thank you so much for just kind of being that naked pastor, opening up and being vulnerable.
Thanks, man. Well, that's the thing, right, with more and more people talking about their journey of deconstruction, and people like you with your podcast and me with the Lasting Supper and so on. One of the coolest responses I get from people is, oh, my God, I'm not crazy, and I'm not alone.
That's huge.
Like this, tons of people are going through this. I'm normal. This is good. And I think that's half of the battle, is realizing you're not crazy, you're growing.
That's a good point. Even though the church is saying we're backsliding. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. I know we've been talking for about an hour. This has been really good. Cool. I mean, once again, I've learned a lot, given me a lot of things to go away and kind of head scratch and think, okay, now I've got to go back and do some more work. So thanks, David, for making me have to work some more. But it's good work to do, isn't it? It's to reconstruct and unpack and unpick some of the stuff that happened. So thanks again for being the naked pastor.
Thanks, man. My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll speak to you again, David.
Okay, talk soon.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with David Hayward as much as I did. I always love talking to David because he's such a practical guy. He's coming out of the very similar backstory to me, being an ex-pastor, being someone who still, though, ironically enough, like myself, I still see myself in very much a pastoral role. And that's why I do the podcast. That's why I love meeting new people like David Hayward and introducing him to you. If you're listening to this and you've been helped, that would be fantastic to hear from you. You can connect with me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can also find David Hayward at Naked Pastor as well on Twitter. In fact, if you just go search those words, as he said, make sure you put those two together. Don't separate Naked Pastor. Don't do a Google image search. You might be completely horrified at what comes up. Look for The Naked Pastor and you will find him. He's a great resource as far as ex-evangelicals, ex-fundamentalists. You can also join the Lasting Supper group if you're looking for a community of support. Now, speaking of support, if you want to be a Patreon supporter of Mindshift Podcast, I would really appreciate it because it helps me cover things like my monthly podcast hosting expenses, website hosting costs, equipment, and so forth. So you can find the link. I will put it in the show notes for my Patreon page if you want to support me on Patreon. And what that gets you is it gets you early releases of episodes on Wednesday, so you don't have to wait till Friday till the content drops. Also, my Reconstruction After Deconstruction online course is available on Patreon as well. And also it gets you into the closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, which, similar to the Lasting Supper, is a very small group, but it's a good supportive group where we have people who are friends of the show, former members of the show who are on it, like David Hayward. He's in there as well. So if you want to chat with David, you can do that as part of the closed group, as well as some of my other guests that I've had on the show. So it's a really good resource for you as a Patreon supporter of this show. And speaking of Patreon supporters, I just wanted to give a big shout out to our newest Patreon supporter, John Medor. I really appreciate all the help that I get in people who support this show. It helps me meet my monthly expenses and keeps this show coming at you every other week. And so I really appreciate John being the newest supporter on Patreon. If you want to find out more information on how to support the show, there is a link in the show notes, and you can go on my Patreon page and pledge your support, and that is, again, greatly appreciated. Also, I just wanted to say you could do me a favor by going on iTunes or Podbean and leaving a review of the show, which definitely will help in the ratings and keep the show boosted. Now, what's coming your way in the next few weeks on Mindshift Podcast? Well, I'm in talks with the guys from the How to Heretic podcast. If you haven't listened into their show, give it a listen. These guys are all ex-Mormons coming out of Utah in the States. And so this is in keeping with my interest in this series on the cults. We're going to be talking to the guys hopefully in the next few weeks. And so I'll be bringing you an episode with the How to Heretics. But for the next episode that's coming up in a couple of weeks, we're going to keep it in Canada. I'm going to be bringing you an interview that I did with Neil604, the atheist from Canada. Now, you can look up his channel on YouTube. You can look up Neil604, and you'll see that he talks to a lot of people around this area of deconversion or spiritual transitions. And so we had a great chat. In fact, one of the really cool things that came out of it was that I'm going to be in Seattle in July for 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of July, doing some work over there back in the States. And so we're going to get together, me and Neil. I'm going to make a trip up to BC where he lives in Canada. And I believe we are going to do an event on Saturday, the 13th of July. Neil and I are going to do a live sort of podcast, YouTube. I'm not sure what we're going to do exactly, whether it's going to be on his channel or we'll just release it as a Facebook live event or something like that. But we're going to get together in Canada in July. So I'm going to be over there. Also, we're going to do an ex-evangelical gathering at some point when I'm in Seattle. So if you are interested in getting together, if you're in the Pacific Northwest area in the first 3 weeks of July, let me know. I would love to meet up with you. I'm going to be in Seattle, as I say, first 3 weeks of July. So we're going to do something. I'm not sure what exactly, but every time I've been back there, we've done a gathering with a bunch of people. We've gone out to dinner, had a few drinks, and just gotten to know each other and had a really great time. So at some point in that first 3 weeks, we'll be getting together. You can follow me on Twitter, send me a message there, DM me about the gathering in Seattle or the live event in British Columbia in July. You can follow me at Mindshift 2018. And also you can find me on Facebook and a couple other places. The contact information is usually in the show notes, at least on Twitter, or you could just do a search on Facebook for the Mindshift Podcast Facebook page and you can find me there. So lots of ways to get a hold of me. Give me your feedback. Give me your thoughts on this show or any other show, ideas for further show notes or whatever. I've got a bunch of great guests all queued up coming your way over the next couple of months as we focus on the world of the cults and talking about how to recover in terms of reconstruction, deprogramming, and a lot of other things. So come back in 2 weeks, I should say, to catch up with Neil 604, the Canadian atheist. So I'll see you in 2 weeks right here on Mindship Podcast.
Yes,